So here we are in COVID-19, and it kind of makes you think, right? So, how do we know that this disease is any different? Well, we know that this disease is different because of knowledge, right? So, we have knowledge of all these other diseases. And we kind of try to take this disease and figure out how it's the same or different from others. That's how we found out it was a different strand. Well, knowledge kind of falls back in the beginning of time, and we keep record of that knowledge through writing it down. But how do we protect the records that we write down? We bind books. So what I'm going to try to do here today is explain to you one of my personal passions. It's called bookbinding. It's a very old art that's gone way into the early times. Around 200 AD at the very least is the last recorded book. Mind you, this is after scrolls and all of that, but we're going to talk about that here in a minute. The reason I like bookbinding so much is because I find it fascinating the different methods that they used to bind the books, to preserve the books, so that way we can study them and have this knowledge. Well, so if you go way back when they discovered fire, right, things were kind of, not exactly the best way of communication. So they sort of had to find this new way to communicate. And that's when language was formed. That's when they could say words. It's when they could talk to each other. Well, it's important that they could talk to each other because when they started to form words, they made language. And language is the way that we convey knowledge. But over time, you tell somebody something, it's kind of like playing the old phone tag game, right? It sort of differs. So they learn how to write down the words. But when they wrote down the words on paper, they had to figure out a way to protect it. Because if you take a piece of paper, I say we take this piece of paper right here, and we write a word on it. Well, the problem is this piece of paper that says word on it, it can get crumpled, it can get ruined, it can get thrown, right? So if it gets thrown like this, how do we keep it safe? Well, the answer was bookbinding. So when they got into bookbinding, they had to figure out a way to protect the paper. Well, one of the resources they had was skin leather. And earlier bookbinding was called Coptic design. Coptic design was basically you take the books and you wrap them in leather. Now, if you follow Samai's archaeology of medieval bookbinding, it's kind of when he goes all the way back to the original bookbinding and works his way up to modern day binding. And believe it or not, this progression of bookbinding led to the decline of book quality. And here's why. You see, it took a long time to write these books, so when they bound all these books after they wrote them, there wasn't very many available, so you could take days, weeks, months to bind a book, and that was common. Or around mid-1400s, a man named Johannes Gutenberg came out with the printing press. Well, the printing press is important. Because the movable type printing press is important because the movable type printing press, it started to be able to take that one press and these blocks and write multiple pages with these blocks instead of how they used to have to do it where they carved out a single page out of a block. When that happened, they got into the more medieval, Renaissance, modern style binding, which is what ultimately led to my favorite style binding, one of the ones that I was actually able to replicate. So I replicated this binding. It's called Gothic bookbinding. And it was a very quick way to make the books. They took the tablet, which is the written word, they put it in here, they sewed it, they put leather on it, and they put a latch. They fastened it. And that's all that there was to it. Well, the problem was, as cool as this book is, they had to start cutting corners in the quality for the quickly mass-produced books. But it still protected the book. It kept it safe. But I'm sure, as you can imagine, when you start cutting qualities, they don't last as long. So books like this led to what we know as modern-day books like this, where it's paperback, it's flimsy, if it gets wet, it's destroyed. It's protected, but very minimally. And that's why bookbinding is so important. Because as you see it, you see the quality decline for quantity to come out. You see knowledge rise, and when the knowledge rises, bookbinding declined. But it was protecting knowledge throughout the eras to get to where we are today. See, my goal with this is to show you how the bookbinding was so fantastically important in everything we did. Why it was so crucial, why it was so instrumental in making what we have. I hope that in this you were able to learn something more than you realized, that a simple book was able to shape the knowledge, the studies, and ultimately the history of mankind as we went. So to kind of recapture this, we went from the origin of the word, when speech was formed, why speech started to be written, how they decided to protect speech. As people started to protect speech, the job that it created, bookbinding, and how it very slowly began to decline in the progression of the modern day book.